let's start with the vaccine rollout. Do we have some details of the study that was carried out that has now led to the halting of the Astravenca vaccine being fully rolled out for South Africans?
In terms of that study, Tolu, what we have learned is that there was a briefing that was held on Sunday this past weekend. And to be quite honest, some of the outcomes of that briefing did cause quite a lot of concern amongst people. And it raised questions about the due diligence process which government had taken. And it really is what led to the halt, or the temporary halt, let me rather say, of that rollout process. The main concern really is that the Astravenca vaccine is not as effective as some of the other vaccines, particularly for the South African context. Now, what we know is that in December, the peak that we saw was caused by that variant, which was first identified here in South Africa. And what we saw is that it really increased the number of cases in South African hospitals. We had many more people admitted, as well as many more people, younger people, falling ill. What the researchers have found is that the Astravenca vaccine is not that effective against some of the milder cases of COVID-19. And I suppose the question would be, why bother with that? However, if we're finding that with people getting COVID-19, there's that number of cases or people that it would spread to, you would want to use a vaccine which would be effective even on milder cases, especially if you know beforehand that it is less effective, and especially if you know beforehand that that particular Astravenca vaccine is actually not the most efficient. But what we did hear in the briefing today, which I think was quite promising and has in a way left people a bit more encouraged than on Sunday's briefing, is that government has actually said it's kind of changing its strategy, and it's going to be focusing on getting the other vaccines that are more effective. Now, that would be the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and we've learned that government is saying that within the next week, they are likely to actually reinitiate that rollout program, but this time using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I think the benefit of that is also that Johnson & Johnson does have partnerships and manufacturing facilities in South Africa. So the receiving of that vaccine would be much quicker as a result of that. Okay,
that's interesting to note, because we know a lot of people, especially on the African continent, have looked at the Astravenca vaccine because of its refrigeration aspect, which doesn't need as much as the others. But that's aside, there's obviously an issue now. So we know that the president promised the first doses of the vaccine to about 1.2 million frontline health workers. Now, with the halt, what is the plan for protecting those who take care of South Africans and who have taken care of South Africans in what is probably the hardest health crisis for any country this side of the 21st century?
Yeah, that has definitely been a big concern. And I think people have been questioning, if we've already purchased these vaccines and the plan was to vaccinate healthcare workers, what happens next? Well, with this new development with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine now entering the fray, they're saying that they are hoping to get 9 million doses, which is significantly more than what we would have gotten from Astravenca. And then they're also saying that they're speaking to the COVAX initiative to see whether there's a way that we can swap some of our vaccines that we procured, the AstraZeneca ones, for the more efficient versions, which would be either the Pfizer or the Johnson & Johnson doses. So what government is essentially saying is that it's not going to be money wasted, but it won't be as immediate a rollout as was initially expected. What I think is helpful is that the healthcare workers have already started registering for that vaccine. So there was a website that was set up by government, and the only difference really would be, instead of them getting AstraZeneca, is that they now use that same registration to start rolling out Johnson & Johnson. And if they are able, in fact, to swap out these vaccines for anything else via COVAX, then it could actually be quite a situation that can be saved to a certain extent.
Okay, so you've mentioned the health minister's press briefing that was held today. So let's take a look at that a bit more. You've talked about the fact that there might still be some kind of rollouts in the next week or so, and that there's a bit more confidence as there has been some explanation. Any other highlights from the public briefing today from the health minister?
Yes, I think that the other highlight really has been the other conversations that government seems to have started. You know, in the beginning, there was a concern that we were putting all our eggs in one basket when it came to our vaccine plan, and there was a lot of confidence in the Astravenca vaccine. And I think from the debacle that has arisen, and the fact that the vaccine is actually mutating quite fast, the government seems to be taking an approach with them actually expanding the inquiries into other areas. So they've mentioned that they are currently in conversation with the Russian vaccine originated for the Sputnik vaccine. They don't have anything conclusive on that as yet, but the conversations have started. I think an important point, considering that we are part of the BRICS initiative, and one would imagine that that should stand us in good stead to be able to receive some of those Russian vaccines. And then they also mentioned that they're talking to Sinopharm, which is the Chinese vaccination program. There is apparently a non-disclosure agreement that's been signed. So that indicates that the conversation is at an advanced stage. And the government has assured us that they will inform us going forward a little bit more about that. So I do think that this morning's briefing did give us a little bit more detail on the what next following that initially concerning briefing. It's given us a bit of relief. In fact, I think considering that many people were concerned about whether South Africa had actually wasted money. And what they also told us is that if they're unable to swap those vaccines, what they will try and do is sell the vaccines to other countries that do not have that strain as prevalent, or in fact use it for research purposes here in South Africa.
So you actually answered my next question, because that is how many 1 million doses. You just can't leave them sitting, even though according to AstraZeneca, they can actually sit for 30 days if you keep them at that refrigeration. So we know what's going to happen next. We've also seen people express concern over vaccines, and we've seen a bit of a rise in anti-vaccine sentiment. So are South Africans ready and willing to take the jab, or has this delay, and what caused the delay, has it affected public trust in the vaccines?
Well, look, I don't think that it's affected public trust in the vaccines. What it has raised a concern is about the management process around vaccines. And that's been a long-standing concern. If you look at what we call now here in South Africa, the PPE scandal, earlier this year, we had a scandal around, or a number of scandals, in fact, around the procurement of protective clothing. And we found that a lot of money was wasted. Companies were registered to be able to procure PPE that were associated with political figures. So there was already an initial concern about how the vaccine process will be handled. Government is procuring the vaccine directly from the suppliers. So it seems that that process is not necessarily a concern. But again, there are those other things like distribution. Who's going to get it? Are the provinces, which actually handle the primary health care, are they effectively equipped to roll out the vaccine once it comes? And I think that the problem is that government's communication has not really been as clear as it can be on those issues. They've tried to centralize the process to a certain extent, but there is going to be a part where the provinces have to take over because they have the facilities under their care. And that is often where we see that the wheels start to fall off, because the resources are not equally matched in all the 9 provinces.
Okay, so we've talked about the vaccines. You've updated us on what the Minister of Health has said. Let's talk about the president. Cyril Ramaphosa is expected, barring any unforeseen circumstance, to address South Africans on February the 11th. What are you expecting he will focus on? We've seen conversations around the economy. We know that the finance minister is also going to make a speech sometime this month as well. Taxes have come into play. Possible fuel rise has also come into play. But for the president, who's opening what is like the political season and government's work this year, what are we expecting to hear from him?
You're right. It really is the opening of the political season here in South Africa. The State of the Nation address kind of sets the tone for the priorities for government each year. And what it also does is it's the official opening of Parliament. And quite honestly, ordinarily, we used to having quite a ceremony around it. It's similar to the State of the Union that takes place in the US. There is a military parade. There's a 21-gun salute. The Speaker of Parliament meets the President on the steps of Parliament. There's a red carpet event, and that's what we ordinarily see. But this year, things are going to be quite different, and it's going to be a hybrid sitting, which means that only about 30 members of the overall 400 members of parliament are going to be actually physically in the National Assembly. We usually have guests from the judiciary as well as from other arms of government like premiers and mayors. None of those people will be attending physically. So it's really going to be a stripped down State of the Nation. In fact, we recently had a briefing from Parliament, and they said that although they had budgeted 2.2 million rand for the State of the Nation address, they're only anticipating spending just about 100,000 rand, which is quite frankly nothing. To be spending on a State of the Nation address. So you can just see that the times have changed so much. When it comes to the speech itself, we are expecting that the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects are really going to dominate on that. We know that South Africa has had a significant number of job losses, and many industries have been affected. And that has a lot of knock-on effects because people have either had to cut back on their expenses. It's also affected government's ability to actually get taxes. So what it means is that going forward, they are going to have to revise their plans when it comes to government spending, when it comes to their infrastructure promises, many of which they made last year. They were quite big infrastructure promises, and that was just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So it's going to be one of those where there will really be a balancing act of trying to make do with what little there is, and also trying to make promises that citizens will obviously expect government to deliver on, but at the same time realizing that living in a pandemic, everything is a moving target. One day, you have a particular situation, and the next day things change so much.
All right, Dianne, before we wrap up, just two final quick questions. Do we expect that the president is going to give any hint in terms of the tax situation? I know that's very big and critical because of how South Africa is expected to pay for the vaccines. Do you expect him to hint it, or he'll leave it completely to the finance minister to deal with?
Well, we usually only have a very slight hint on the issues like tax, and that's really something that is reserved for the budget speech, which always takes place about 2 weeks following the State of the Nation address. So the State of the Nation address is very much of a high level a speech. It just gives the real highlights package of what government is prioritizing, and then the budget generally goes into the meat of that, and it actually comes with quite a lot of big documents that gives government spending plan for the year, as well as touching on the next 3 years. So we anticipate tax, issues of government spending, also issues of where government will be reducing spending. That will be a major theme in the upcoming budget speech, which is expected to take place around the 24th of this month.
All right, so finally, Dianne, the scientists say that South Africa has recently passed the peak of the second wave of infections, but they have warned of another possible surge in the winter months around June. Officials have also said that people need to understand the first defense is washing hands, wearing masks, socially distancing, and staying away from large crowds and crowded spaces. South Africans, like many of us, are tired of the limits to social interaction and the restrictions, but they are necessary. Are South Africans still observing all recommended protocol? Are they ready to dig in and be in this fight for the long run?
Well, I must say, on the issue of wearing masks, I believe that South Africans have really adopted that as a way of life. Particularly because it was made absolutely mandatory to the extent where you could actually be fined for not wearing a mask. We recently saw at a very high-profile funeral that took place a few weeks ago. It was a funeral of the minister in the presidency. One of the premiers, the premier of Mpumalanga, was caught on camera not wearing a mask. And it was a huge controversy here because people were saying, you cannot expect normal citizens to wear a mask. And the premier is walking around without that mask. And she actually went to the police station and paid an admission of guilt fine for doing that. So it's really become a normality here. We have seen that some of the restrictions have been reduced now. Restaurants have been allowed to trade fully now and sell liquor. The curfew hours have been reduced, as well as beaches are now open, and some small gatherings like church gatherings are allowed. But I think everyone has has come to terms with the fact that this is something that is going to change. We are almost a year into a COVID-19 lockdown here in South Africa, and we're just going through different levels, whether it be level 1 or level 3 or an advanced level 3, as we've now started calling it. And we're just accustomed to it. People do sometimes have some difficulty. We've seen protests over the fact that the beaches were closed. And in fact, there's an expected protest around the fact that there were liquor sales that were not permitted because the liquor industry has been very hard hit by that. So you see that difficulty, but at the same time, people are complying.
All right, we'll end it there, but we'll definitely check back in with you. Dianne Hawker, South African journalist and editor, thank you so much for joining us on Breakfast Central and giving us a bit of insights into the vaccine rollouts, the upcoming State of the Nation address, and of course, what the health minister said in that public briefing. We'll talk again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.